Hey, everybody. It is time to talk about it's a novel, not a history lesson. And we're going to come at that from all different sides. But thank you all for being here. And thanks to the amazing panelists that I know we're going to have a great conversation. But before we dive into this, let's get started with introductions, starting with Doc.
Good afternoon. I'm Doc Coleman, and I am I'm a steampunk author. I'm stuttering today. So in writing an alternate history series, I have to not only know the real history, I have to know the changes that I'm making to history and be able to introduce them to the audience so that they understand how things are playing out differently, or how things are playing out, whether they knew the original history or not. All
right, Jean Marie.
Hi, Jean Marie Ward here. I write fiction, nonfiction, and everything in between. And I'm a total history nerd. I just love it because basically anything you can find in fiction, you can find in history, only weirder.
Very true. Rebekah?
Hi, everyone. I'm RF Kuang, also known as Rebekah in Casual Conversation. I joined a bit late because of internet issues, so I think I missed what the prompt was, but I write very historically informed novels, such as the Popular Trilogy and the forthcoming Babel, which deals a lot with 1830s England and the history of colonialism. So I think the prompt was, why are we interested in history?
And Wendy.
And last but not least, I suppose, I'm Wendy Van Camp. I'm mainly known as a speculative poet. But I do write science fiction and I write a historical series. It's basically Regency England, and it's based off the characters of Jane Austen's work Persuasion. And my book has a little more historical detail and maybe a little less of the romance elements, but I always found that Jane Austen was more concerned with relationships as a whole, not necessarily steamy romance or anything. It was always very low key. And I just find putting in enough historical detail into my work, it really helps set it apart from other things in that particular genre. And I'm just delighted to be here. Thanks.
Awesome. And I'm Gail Z. Martin, and Morgan Bryce. As Gail, I write epic fantasy, urban fantasy, steampunk, near future post-apocalyptic fantasy, and more. And as Morgan Bryce, I write urban fantasy, male paranormal romance. I love history, was a history major, and history factors into all my books, whether they're set in medieval times, in the 1920s, in late 1800s, alternative history, Victorian era, or diving into the history of places and regions for mining them for ghost story scandals and all kinds of weird and mysterious stuff. So the title of the panel is it's a novel, not a history lesson. Authors sometimes turn down the wrong alley when we get so in love with our research that we want to share it with the world, and this can become a huge info dump. How do you share the history that is essential for your readers to know in your books and attempt to avoid that page upon page info dump? Wendy?
Well, in my case, I take a page from George Lucas. When I was growing up, I of course loved Star Wars, and I really liked this new new at that time anyway, new directing style that he developed. And he always said that he created this rich world by just dropping in little bits and pieces, like a little animal pops up in the scene before the main action starts. And I have kind of taken that to heart as a writer. I'm trained as a certified gemologist, and like I actually been trained to appraise jewelry from the Regency area and Victorian eras. And so I use some of that knowledge to place items into my writing that are historically accurate and help set the flavor of the scene. But I don't like to basically info dump, as you brought up. I like to just use these little details as spice in my writing. And I find that my readers do appreciate that. They feel that they're kind of in the place because of that. And it really helps to move the story along without getting in the way.
Okay, Rebekah?
Well, I really love footnotes because I used to have a big problem with explaining way too much historical and factual information to the point where my editor would have to put in the comments box, like, please, we need to move the story along. You can't spend, like 500 words talking about the history of the irrigation system of whatever city. So, for the Poplar trilogy, I didn't have footnotes in the first book, so I could just introduce them in the sequels. So I would dribble in whatever historical information the characters needed to know through dialogue and like necessary exposition. But for my new project, Babel, since it really is just an exercise in nerding out, I found that footnotes are a really wonderful place to, give readers who are curious in that kind of thing opportunities to explore further, but to also give readers an option to skip all of that extraneous detail and just move forward with the main narrative.
Okay, Jean Marie?
Well, it depends on what I'm writing. And yeah, I would love to talk about the entirety of the socio-political situation. It's the relic of being a political science major. But I generally try to make the setting and environment, it's different because the way things are described are different. What people are doing. There are no cars on the street, for example. The buildings look different. The size of the street and what people are wearing look different. And the references to political situation look different. So I tend to scrub it down to the bare minimum that you need to move through the world, though I love the lushness of it. However, having said that, I frequently get dinged by editors going, so when is this happening? And this was a story. I had thrown a reference in the first 3 pages of the story to the burning of the Forbidden City. Now, if you know anything about Chinese history, and I know that Rebekah does, this could only happen at 1 year, with regard, if it's happening in the Ming Dynasty, it's only happening in 1 year. However, my editor said, so what year is it? And I'm going, but everybody knows. No, they don't. So I had to insert, and forgive me for mangling the name of the emperor, the name of the Yongle emperor, because otherwise, who would know? And he still wasn't happy. It really didn't matter for the story that it was that, everybody knew the name of the emperor or they knew 1421, but I couldn't say 1421 without, being outside of the characters' heads, because they would not think of it as 1421. They would think of it as this many years into the reign of their emperor. And that is something that happens throughout history. It's not just a Chinese convention. The Romans, all of the kings in medieval Britain and so forth and so on would talk about the regnal, talk about being X number of years in the reign of Alfred. And so trying to get that balance between what your characters would think and do and what modern audiences with a different view of dating and other things would think and do is rough.
Yeah.
Good point, Doc?
Okay, so I have a certain advantage in my setting in that I have 2 very knowledgeable main characters, and the story is being told by a narrator who is traveling with them, who effectively knows nothing. So I can avoid I avoid info dumps altogether by having the narrator ask questions about what's going on and who are these people. And in the course of my series, I'm also traveling to different places around the world. So everything is kind of strange and new. So I have got ample opportunities to describe and explain and have the more worldly and educated people with them describe the differences in culture. And sometimes this gives me great comedic dialogue because my narrator misunderstands something and they have to gently correct him. But it gives me an awful lot of chance to map out where they are and what's going on without getting into boring info dumps. The other thing to do, because I have changed a lot of history, but for the most part, the characters know the changes. I wrote my first book originally for audio, so I expected to release it in a podcast with basically a chapter a week. So at the beginning of each chapter, I kind of take a half step back from the action that's going on, and I can relate some historical detail or some philosophical detail that gives you a flavor for the history and the culture, and then pulls things right back into the action. And for me, it's worked pretty well. Honestly, I've been very inspired by Sharon Lee and Sam Miller, who, while they're writing sci-fi, they're having to get the readers adjusted to multiple cultures that are clashing, and they do an excellent job of just immersing you into the people living in these cultures, doing a lot more show than tell. And I've kind of tried to model some of my style on their writing.
Yeah, I think we've had some terrific ideas already expressed here on how to get across pieces of history without stopping the action entirely for a lecture. Rebekah mentioned the word dribble, and I love that, because there are opportunities, if there is no way to show something that the reader really needs to know to understand what's going on, you can put a sentence or two here and there. You can spread it out. Where it becomes a real problem is when you just stop everything for paragraph upon paragraph, page upon page. That's when you really lose the momentum of the story, and people are going, who was talking again, when we weren't getting the history lesson, and it becomes didactic. And I think this is difficult for us as authors because we do the research, we dive into the world, we find all these really cool things that we want to share, but it doesn't really have anything to do with the story, but it's really cool. And that's what reader groups are for, and behind the scenes and behind the page kind of things. You don't have to put it all out there on the page. And I loved Doc's idea about showing, and Jean Marie's comment about showing the people in the culture or the time period immersed in what they're doing, so that we know what is going on because they know what is going on, or having to ask questions. The new guy comes to town, doesn't understand what's going on. Those are some wonderful techniques. What haven't we mentioned yet? I know there are more out there. What other techniques do you use to get across the important information when you don't want to slow the action down? Jean Marie?
Revision. Revision.
That too.
I mean, let's face it, if you love history, if you love what you're researching, you're going to go down a rabbit hole or two or three, or maybe as many rabbit holes as you have pages in the story. Usually this will mean that your story is way too long for your intended market. And that's where you go and put it in a drawer for 24, hopefully 48 hours or longer if it's a longer work. And then go back and go, is this actually forwarding the action? Is this something that they need to know? And how fast can I transmit the fact that they need to know it, so that it comes out doing what, Rebekah was saying, that it's dribbling, or it comes out doing as Doc says, you have a new character who has to show up in a scene and they don't know what's going on. And you explain to them this. But that's sort of the technique you use with anything you're writing, even contemporary fiction or urban fantasy, because there's a lot going on that, like, hey, we just magically blew up the Library of Congress. Are you sure it isn't a gas leak? No, I saw the wizard.
Yeah, you don't have to explain the wizard. You don't have to explain the magic. Wizard explosion equals magic. Yeah. Rebekah?
So one thing I was thinking about, which I don't know if anybody's mentioned, is if you have the characters in academic settings, that's the perfect environment for long lectures about history and debates over historiography. And I think that's why both the Poppy War and Babel have many scenes in classrooms where the teacher just explains everything for pages and pages, and then the students get an opportunity to push back on that narrative and clarify things and ask about mysteries. And then that's exactly the perfect dialogue that you as the writer need as a template to inject all the information you want in a way that makes a lot of organic sense for the story. So I do a lot of those classroom scenes, and I'm just lucky that readers are patient enough to stick with them.
Okay, Wendy?
One technique I like to use is language. When I'm writing in a certain time period, there are certain catchphrases and terms that people of the time use that we don't necessarily use today. They have a different cadence in their dialogue and speech. There are certain assumptions that are common then, but perhaps are not common now. So I try to tap into all those things. I research small terms and then I pop them into the story, into the plot line as like a minor thing. Like, for instance, a bear herder was somebody who chaperoned people going on the grand tour back in the Regency era. And it was usually like a college professor. So I worked it in as a joke. An older brother was shepherding a younger brother at a ball, and he was jokingly saying, "I'm going to be your bear herder." And I had to explain the term in a way that the reader could pick up what that was, but they would also get it out of context of the conversation. And I find that's a very easy way to work in history as they lived it, the way the culture was, as opposed to info dumping things, because our characters in the day-to-day were not thinking necessarily about the way the world was, the government, the wars, or even if they were a soldier, if they were back in England, they were probably more worried about chasing the girls than they were about the battles that they had come home from, unless they had a little PTSD, of course, which one of my characters actually does. So I work that in as well. But I don't necessarily explain it. I expect the reader to pick it up. And from what I hear from my reader feedback, they are, and they really like that. They don't like to be bludgeoned with too much detail. In our modern age, we have been trained in a sense by media, by movies. And when you say certain things, I have been really surprised that an image will pop up and it's almost universal among my readers, even though I describe it very briefly.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's because of media and how we're all kind of, in a sense, indoctrinated in the movies. And we have certain ideas that we automatically go to just because it's been in our environment so long. And as a writer, I like to tap into these subconscious things.
Mm-hmm. I love the idea of context clues and trusting your reader to be smart.
Yes.
Where you don't have to explain everything. Now that's where beta readers come in, because if you think you've given people a sufficient context clue, or maybe you've just read an awful lot of history that other people haven't, and you think you've given them enough to go on, and your beta readers all come back and go, I have no idea what this means, then yeah, you probably do need to throw in a sentence there or give it some additional explanation. But in many cases, we can pick up what's going on just by watching it, mm-hmm. or seeing the position of the word in a sentence, how it's used, how people react to it. And we don't need to stop and have an entire side conversation around it. Doc, what would you add?
I like Rebekah's point about the academicness, because one of my two intelligent characters is a professor. So he does tend to go into lecture mode, but the other intelligent character knows that he's going into a lecture and she tends to cut him off and answer the question asked that was right to the point. And that often ends up with some lovely comedic banter. So that's a way to start giving the information and then get to the point and cut to the point, rather than drowning in detail. But another thing that I tend to do is do callbacks. And because I'm writing a comedic story, that's very much part and parcel of it. But you think about how people really react. You say something, they ask a question, you give them a brief explanation, they don't understand it, they nod and move on. And sometime later, when it really becomes apparent that they didn't understand the explanation, they'll ask somebody else. And you can definitely do that, and it's something that's both relatable for the reader, and it lets you give important pieces of information over and over again, but slowly, so that it doesn't feel redundant.
Okay, now we had a question, and this really kind of opens up a whole kettle of fish on how much research is too much. I'll give you all time to laugh hysterically. How do you know when you're done researching? How do you keep from researching eternally and never getting around to writing the book? How do you know when you have to go back and do more research? Rebekah?
Well, for me, the research starts from the moment I get the smallest fragment of an idea for a story, and it continues up until the point that copy edits are in, and I literally can't do any more research, because at all stages, like the first draft, the second draft, the revisions, editing, so part of it is because I am a student, and I study topics that are very closely tied to the things that I write about. So every time I'm in class and I hear about some interesting anecdote, I think of a way to shoehorn that into my manuscript, and they go together constantly. So my research and my academic readings are constantly informing the shape of the story, and the only thing that really stops me from never finishing the story is deadlines. Like, the book has to go out into the world at some point, and there's no such thing as a finished book. It's the curse of published authors that there will always be a typo, no matter how many times you've gone over the whole thing, read it out loud with a red pen, etc. There's always a way that the book could be better, but you can't sit on it forever. At some point, your readers have to be able to see it. So that's for me when the research ends. But otherwise, there's no point at which I'm like, okay, I think I've done enough. The story is perfect. I think a lot of authors agree. We never feel like the book is perfect.
Very true. Jean Marie?
Well, pretty much the same. I get an idea. I know that I don't know enough. I go research it. I think I've got everything that I need for my plot. And then I'm 1/3 of the way through, and you go, oops, I didn't think about that. Meanwhile, I'm checking things out on the web. I'm looking for visual resources. I'm looking for paintings, for scrolls, for whatever's out there. And suddenly it hits me. How did they heat the Forbidden Palace? How did they heat the Forbidden City? I don't know. I can't find it. Oh, crap. What do I do about this scene? And yeah, I still have no idea. And that story has never been written. But yeah, there's always a moment like that, oh, wait a minute. Did they have this kind of window in medieval England? Or how did they do this in Venice in the 16th century? Oh, wasn't it cold without glass in ancient Athens in the winter? Oops. Yeah, there's always something that's coming back, to bite you in the middle of writing a story. And so you're doing it. I confess that I will probably do it Generally, I will stop before copy edits, but I just had a story that was actually not historical and I was still doing it at copy edits.
Okay, Doc?
So I tend to do a little bit different methodology. And the real answer is, you figure out, you experiment until you figure out what kind of research pattern is going to work well for you. But I tend to do some initial research into the settings so that I get a feel for it and I have what I think is a basic understanding of the culture that I'm going to be thrusting my characters into, so that so I can figure out what the conflicts are, who the players are, what misunderstandings I have, and then pretty much dive into the first draft and write that through. And when I go through and do the second draft, that's really when I do my research. In the first draft, I write things the way that I think they ought to work. And this gets me through a draft. And because I'm writing an alternate history, I do have some freedom there to change the way that things happen. Although I still like to add as many authentic historical details to give verisimilitude to the environment. But when I go back through and do the second draft, that's when I start paying attention to all those little questions that Jean Marie was talking about, and I put those into my manuscript as notes. And when I get through the second draft, then I go back and research all those notes and then work it back into the text. And then, of course, when I send it off to beta readers, one of the things I ask them to do is to add in any questions where they don't understand something. And I've been very lucky in the past that I've either gotten people who questioned technology that it turned out I had researched and gotten right, or they saw something, were curious enough about it themselves, and they sent me their research on it. So,
okay, Wendy.
I hate to say this, but I don't do a lot of research on my first draft at all. I'm very similar to Doc in that way. I really want to focus more on the characters, their relationships, and how it's going to fit together first before I really worry about historical details. I have a general idea of the time period. I know kind of how the buildings are. Like I said, I've researched this in the past. I've had a lot of classes in the time period. So I use that as kind of my basis. And then once I get the story drafted, I look at bits and pieces about, like if there's a battle, I look up the historical details of that battle. I look for names of people that I might be able to pull into my story from that research and assign them to roles that are already there. But I don't really spend a lot more time. I guess I'm a little different. I like a little more brevity, I guess. Once I feel that everything is flowing well, I don't worry about it after that point. I just move on. We all got more books to write, right? Or poetry to write. So I don't want to overwhelm my readers too much with too much detail anyway, but I just want to make sure what details I use are correct. And I think I just wanted to bring up some research technique, if that's okay. For those of you who are new to doing research.
Well, hold the research technique, because that's another question. We're going to go around.
Oh, I apologize, Gail. I'll save it for them then.
No problem. We'll hit that next. And, I think what's fascinating here is how different authors are in their approach and how their comfort level, how their minds work, how their outlining works, how they get into the first draft. I think it's really interesting. And for folks listening out there, it means there's no wrong way to do it if it serves you and it serves your story. I'm definitely a research upfront person to a point, and it's not always time period. I use a lot of occult legend and lore and mythology and occult ritual. So I want to get that as right as I can for the traditions that I'm drawing from. And so that's a lot of research that I need to do. I may be looking into, one of my favorites is looking for hellgates. There are a lot of them around, according to urban legend, and different local types of monsters or scandals or mysterious disappearances. And as I'm doing that, I'm creating the plot and saying, ooh, I can use that. Okay, let's start with that, and we can pull that in. And that to me is part of how I generate the story. And so when I am working, if I get stuck after I've done my outline, it's usually because there's a piece of information that I don't have, that I don't know that I don't have. And if I go out and I do some research, I find it and it's like, that's the key, that's the missing piece. I didn't know what it was, but now I do. And I can go back in and do that. Research techniques, as Wendy brought up, everybody looks at things differently, but share with us, please, what some of your favorite research techniques are. Wendy?
Okay, first off, I happen to get some links for our audience. Let me just grab it here. These are just general researching places that I go to. Let me paste that in there. Hopefully it'll all turn up. There we go. These are really basic ones. If depending on what historical time period you're writing about, but because I do steampunk and I'm doing the Regency period, these have been very good for me. Don't use Wikipedia. It is not really a very good source for your historical detail. It's good to maybe point you in the right direction, but I would not trust it to be an authentic place to get your info from. Go to some of these places. These are British newspaper archives, the National Archives, the Library of Congress. Project Gutenberg is also really good. They have a lot of historical novels that may be written in your time period, and they're good sources to look at too. They might spark a lot of new ideas for you, but make sure you try to get to a primary source for your information. I know with me, even though I go light on historical detail, but I do that on purpose. I want the flow of the story to be prominent in what I write. But when I do work in detail, if I want to pull a name out of history, I want to make sure that person is right, because I don't want someone to come back later and go, hey, that person didn't exist, or they were in a different part of the world or whatever. And you just want to double check things. And so that's kind of my main tip, is just be authentic and make sure your sources are good.
Okay, Rebekah?
I think it's good to start with secondary survey sources, just because they give you a general idea of, broad historical outlines and dates, etc. But I found, especially working on this early Victorian novel that's coming out next year, that the only way to really get a sense of what life was truly like in the 1830s is not from some massive volume from 2011 that does, like a social history, a labor history, etc. Like, these scholars are writing about life in terms that the people who lived them would not have used to describe themselves. So what you really want are primary sources, right? Look at newspapers, look at pamphlets written in that era. I particularly enjoy looking at novels and guidebooks to Oxford written by people in the early 19th century, because even though those novels are very stylized, they still give me a better idea of like the slang that was used at Oxford, the way that people spoke, the terms that they used to describe themselves. And like, for example, there's a scene in Babel that takes place at a commemoration ball, which still happens at Oxford, and May balls still happen at Cambridge, but the way those balls are conducted and the fashions people wear to them and this little rules of social etiquette at those balls are so different between those balls now and the early 19th century. But in the book, Tom Brown at Oxford, there's a great description of, the main character being at the ball and his female relatives and, what they're wearing and how they're talking to the other ball attendees. So just for a flavor of life, right, literature from that time period is going to be your best guide. But it's also important to remember that every single historical source, primary or secondary, has an agenda. Scholars have an agenda, whether they know it or not. They're writing from a certain epistemology. And newspaper editorials might be written from a radical's perspective. It might be written from a conservative perspective, right? You have to think about who's authoring these pamphlets and what social position they occupy. And once you've sorted through all of that, you have a better idea of how to fill in the colors and particular social conventions of the period that you're writing in.
Okay, Jean Marie.
Well, it's sort of a combination for me. I understand the importance of primary sources because I live with a scholar who, if it ain't primary, if it ain't contemporary, it ain't worth much, which is rather hard when you happen to be a scholar of the Dark Ages in Europe. But I do believe that you do need to start from a secondary source or need to start from whatever kicks off your imagination. For me, it's the visual. I have a lot of secondary source materials that have paintings, that have drawings, that have prints from a host, that have statuary from a host of periods. And that feeds me. Then it's go to a secondary source to know the broad outlines of the history of the period you're looking at. Then it's a deep dive, depending on what I need for the story, because you're not going to need the same amount of data for a short story that you're going to need for a novel. You have to match what you're doing to what you've got. For some things, if you're doing a very personal story, say between a servant and their master in medieval Europe, you need a little of that social history. You might need to read some of the romances of the period, where a maid plays a role. For example, in Tristan and Isolde, you may need to read that, but you do not need to know specifically the composition of a cure for blindness that was found in an Anglo-Saxon document that was just unearthed in a peat bog, because that's not the story. And that too is, getting back to one of your earlier questions, a technique for keeping yourself from going into a data dump. Hey, I don't need this to tell this story, but you do need to basically make your world of that story seem real and be able to have your reader look beyond it and say, there's a whole world out there. But yeah, the combination of secondary, Wikipedia, encyclopedias, Time Life, the old Time Life book series with all those wonderful visuals, and then the literature of the period. If you happen to be in a period such as both Wendy and Rebekah are working in right now, there is a saying in history, after the 18th century, it's all journalism. And because thanks to the internet, you can get all of that stuff online. It's amazing.
Doc?
Okay. When talking about research, the first thing is remember that you don't have to know everything. You need to know slightly more than you're going to show the reader. So whenever you're looking up something, you need to understand how that information relates to your story and what kind of a difference finding the answer is going to make in how you present your story. Now, a lot of people like to discourage Wikipedia because of the idea that anyone can go into Wikipedia and write anything they want. And the thing is, that's not exactly true. There are people who fact check everything in Wikipedia, and if you make an entry and you don't provide a source, they will remove that. So while you don't want to go to Wikipedia and just read it and believe what you read, Wikipedia gives you a nice overview and a lovely list of sources at the bottom. And you follow those links and you go to the sources and you read those sources, and they'll either be primary sources or they'll be secondary sources, which will help you on the trail back to primary. If you use Wikipedia correctly, it can be very beneficial. And it also depends on the level of detail that you need. I mean, bizarre things, of all the things that I've had to research to make my stories work, most of them involve fashion. You know, what did people wear? How did they refer to these garments? The story I'm currently writing, I actually got to the point where I had to look up what was traditional Indian underwear, of all things. But I didn't need to go into great depth about the history. I just needed to know what the garment was, roughly what it looked like, how easy it was going to be for someone that had never seen it before to understand how to put it on properly, and I was done. You can go into deep dives if you think it'll make your world more supported, but the deep dives are also where you get lost. So you need to go into your research thinking about how deep is deep enough.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And, you know, a lot of museums and historical associations have now digitized an amazing amount of stuff, from maps to journals to letters to all kinds of public documents. And then if you find a particular niche, like I was looking at coal mining in northwestern Pennsylvania, a lot of historical groups dedicated to preserving the history of coal mining in Pennsylvania. And they had a massive of information that they had digitized. So, and most of that is free. Nearly all of that is free, especially the museum stuff. So that can really help if you need to know what an area looked like at a certain time in history. And of course, now it doesn't look like that. Those maps, the railways, the original names of streets, all of that is usually out there for free if you can find the right museum archive. I'm also going to join in with Doc and Jean Marie on defending Wikipedia, because I think it is a great jumping off point. And if you need a vague answer like, was there gunpowder in 1450? And you go to Wikipedia and they say, why, yes, it was invented XYZ. Okay, if that's in a rough time period and you're doing speculative fiction, it's probably good enough. You don't need to know the day of the week and the middle name of the guy who invented it. You just need to know you're roughly right. That can be a great way to speed the research along. And I've often found that the hyperlinks in a Wikipedia citation that lead me down the rabbit hole to other related things often get me where I need to go, even if I don't know I need to go there when I start researching it, because they're related, and then other related links turn up and I follow that chain and I find myself, I find the cool stuff that I need because someone else has said, hey, this is related, and maybe you ought to know this. So I'm not gonna bash Wikipedia. I know it's not high class, but back in the day, there were teachers who wouldn't let you use Encyclopedia Britannica because it was not scholarly enough. So, you know, use the tools that you can use comfortably and well. And if it doesn't work for you, that's fine. Doc, you were gonna say something?
Sometimes it's absolutely frightening, the things that you can find, especially when you're talking about people pointing out something and saying, oh, that's an anachronism, and and you research it, you find out how old some of these things are. Like most of our modern weapon designs are effectively small tweaks on designs over 100 years old.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Well, folks, believe it or not, we are coming up to the end of the hour, and I want to make sure we have time to go around to everybody and let folks know where they can find you online. And if you have a recent release, a new release, an upcoming release, this is a good time to tell us about it. So let's start with Wendy.
Okay, I'm just gonna pop my stuff into the chat, if that's okay. Basically, I do have a new release coming up. The Curate's Brother is the first of a series of 4 Regency historical novels. Book 2, crossing my fingers, will be out for Christmas. It's called Christmas in Kellogg, and it continues the story of Anne Elliot and Frederick Wentworth and Charles Musgrove, which again is a prequel to Jane Austen's Persuasion. So if you love Persuasion, you will more than likely get into my book. You can find me just in general as a speculative poet and science fiction writer at nowastedink.com. I'm also a poetry illustrator. You can buy my poetry as art prints on Etsy, and the link is in the chat. Thanks.
Great. Rebekah?
Well, my Poppy War trilogy is complete as of last November, so all 3 volumes, The Poppy War, The Dragon Republic, and The Burning God, can be found where books are sold. And my next book, Babel, is not available for pre-order yet, as it's not out until September 2022, but you can find all relevant details at my author website at www.rfkuang.com. I'll also put it in the chat. And I've recently started a newsletter, which is a one-stop shop for all new information about the book, where you can find signed copies, when it's going on sale, when there will be a cover, etc. And that's free to sign up for if you're interested. And that information is also over at my author website.
Great. Jean Marie?
Hi, okay. My main web presence is jeanmarieward.com. I'm on Facebook and Twitter in variations of the name. I put that all on chat. I'm also on Instagram, but not really there that often. I mainly use it to follow other people. I'm lazy. But my next upcoming release is a story called Fire Sale, which is a modern day fantasy set in California during the wildfires of 2020. Yeah, it's a comedy. I don't like to make things easy for myself. It will be coming up in Zombies Need Brains anthology, The Modern Deities Guide to Surviving Humanity. That should be out this summer. I have a urban fantasy and a steampunk coming out from Falstaff, but I have no clue when. But if you want to see what I've written in the past, including a lot of historical fantasy, one of my favorites being Something on the War of 1812. Yeah, I do not choose easy subjects. And that can be found, all the links can be found at jeanmarieward.com.
Doc?
The easiest way to find my stuff is to go to doccoleman.com. All my published works are available on Amazon. If you go there and search for Doc Coleman Steampunk, and you can find The Perils of Prague, the first novel in the Crackle and Bang series, The Shining Cog, which is a collection of short stories, most of which are set in the Crackle and Bang world. And I'm currently working on The Kindred of Khalid, which is the second novel in the series. And right now it's looking like it should be coming out sometime in the next year, but I don't have firm dates yet. But
Awesome.
And if you want to talk more about this subject, I will be over in Discord in the Mount Washington room.
Great. I put all my contact information in the chat. The newest release we have is Chicagoland, came out from Falstaff Books just last month. And as Morgan Bryce, the latest release there is Haven. So thank you very much to all of our wonderful panelists, and thanks to everybody who showed up to watch and listen. And of course, thank you to the Balticon programming gods and our amazing tech people for making this possible. So folks, have a wonderful weekend. Enjoy the rest of Balticon, and thanks so much for coming out to hang out with us.
All right then.
Everybody, great job. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Great job as at moderating,
Yeah.
as usual. So, yeah, I wanted to get into something that Doc touched on, but there was so much else going on. I decided not to, about when people come after you to correct your quote mistakes, only
Oh,
they
God.
aren't.
Don't get me started. I had someone write a full article about my book about how dare I have a male narrator in my book. And I'm like, what? I mean, oh my God.
When the-
Buddy.
I had just
Ah.
had I just had a review that and it proved the whole idea of how much is too much. It was a Deadly Curiosities book. I make several comments of about 1 or 2 lines at a time, referring to the fact that Charleston is a beautiful city built on rivers of blood, that its prosperity came from the mistreatment and enslavement of people. And then this particular book also dealt with the Caribbean. And I said that it was even worse in the sugar plantations. And this reviewer said, well, she did acknowledge it, but I really would have liked to have seen her go into more detail about the conditions on the sugarcane plantations in Bermuda, in the Bahamas, Barbados. I'm going,
Oh, man.
everybody, nothing.
I gotta close it out. Thank you so much, Mar, and hope to see you around.